Hello, my dears, and welcome back to the Ages of Chaos. Now, as I said at the beginning of the last video, you may remember that I apologised for the tone of that video owing to a certain degree of negativity. Oh no, that wasn't the last video, was it? That was the one prior to that. The original 3rd Ed Chaos Codex. Oh my god, yes. Given that that was generally a negative video, this one, I apologise for saying, is going to be the most negative of the lot. The most negative. As you fans of the Fluffenhammer may know, we like to keep things relatively positive. This is, after all, a hobby. And we like to focus on the more positive aspects and not the more sort of fanboyish, temper tantrum, toys out of pram aspect, which certainly does exist out there. However, it's very difficult with the product we're going to be focusing on in this video. It's very difficult to say anything positive at all, I'll be honest, in any respect. Today, we are going to be diving deep into what was considered the dark days of Games Workshop. There was a period of Games Workshop when a particular CEO took control, and the company, like so many companies, made it its principal business to please its shareholders rather than its fans. Shareholders who, by the by, clearly had no idea of what had made the company so successful up to that point, and clearly had no particular love for the hobby. The result had a massively negative impact on all of the gaming systems, but 40k most of all, interestingly. A lot of the tertiary games like the Epic system, like Blood Bowl and whatnot, and like Battlefleet Gothic, that were very popular at the time, went the way of the dodo back then, because there was this focusing down upon the core game systems, because they were the ones that sold. Obviously, 40k in particular. There was also this hideous, very almost like MMO quality, this sort of like mobile phone video game quality that crept in. It was almost pay to play, whereby they were trying to restructure the existing armies to force players to structure their armies and to make purchases in the way that the company wanted them to, rather than how hobbyists wanted to engage with their hobby. So, for example, they would deliberately undermine particular units or particular army builds so as to force players to collect different types of armies or to buy the next big expensive kit or whatever. It was a very, very bad time, and a lot of people fell away at that point, including myself. I became a sort of a background hobbyist. I engaged with the background, and that was it. I still collected and read the fiction. I sometimes kept up with the army books if I wanted them, but beyond that, I just wasn't interested. I really, really wasn't interested because of what they were doing with the gaming system, with the miniatures, with the way they were treating their fans, which was appalling. I mean, at the time, it was absolutely appalling. And again, a disclaimer, this has all ended now. The new Games Workshop, as people are calling it, is fantastic. I have so few complaints, and even those that exist are very quibbling and minor. I'm very pleased with the way the hobby is now, because it is being treated as a hobby. It's engaging and interacting with fans on a very fundamental level, and is reacting to what they want, to what they demand. And it's working. It's clearly working. But at this time, Games Workshop largely withdrew from its fans. It didn't even have an internet presence. In the burgeoning days of the internet, it didn't have an internet presence. It didn't have what would have been back then a MySpace page. It didn't have Facebook. It didn't have a YouTube channel. It didn't have anything. It didn't take advantage of those, even though it's clearly an ideal company and an ideal subject for those mediums. It didn't take advantage of them at all. In fact, it wasn't up until very, very, very recently, well late in the game, that Games Workshop got any kind of media presence at all online. And that's kind of appalling. I mean, to be fair, absolutely fair to them, they have doubled down on that to the nth degree. They have made up for that and then some. We now have wonderful things like the Warhammer community page, we have the Facebook pages, we have the communities online, we have Warhammer TV, which is fantastic, we have the podcast, the Stormcast. It's really good. I mean, it's really, really quite positive, the current state of play, and I feel like I need to assert that before we delve deep into the mire that is to come. Before we get into that, though, we do need to take a look at what was happening on the fantasy battle scene, because on the back of the 3.5 Codex, Codex, which was so successful, and on the back of the Eye of Terror campaign, which again was massively successful and a big draw for Games Workshop. The year following that, they did exactly the same in Fantasy Battle. They did this massive relaunch for the Chaos Forces, but it was a tome that attempted to do in Fantasy Battle what the 3.5 Codex did in 40k. So it was focused very dynamically and very narratively upon Archaon. They launched this, they were building up to this massive worldwide campaign called the Storm of Chaos, which was just the Fantasy Battle equivalent of the Eye of Terror campaign. So just as Abaddon drew together all of the forces of chaos and launched them at Cadia, so Archaon was drawing together all of the tribes and chaos champions and beastman hordes of the north, and was drawing them together to launch this insane campaign against the lands of the south in the old world. So you had all of these new miniatures coming out, you had all of these new Chaos Champions, which were fantastic, some of which are still in use, by the way. If you look at the Fate Caster from the Disciples of Tzeentch book, that is the Chaos Lord of Tzeentch from that era. If you look at, I can't remember what it's called, but there's the Nergal Chaos Champion in the Maggotkin book, that's the sort of hooded, shrouded character on the back of a big rotting horse with a big scythe. That was the Nergal Chaos Lord miniature from that era, but which is now, they're so good that they've been transplanted over to the newer books, because they are stunning molds. They are absolutely stunning molds, and the book was fantastic. For the first time, you really got this dynamism in the Warriors of Chaos. You really got this sense that they were a building threat and that some power was organizing them, which was obviously Archaon. This would have been the second Archaon miniature, even though the first Archaon miniature is newer than the original Abaddon miniature, and we're still using. But the new Archaon miniature of the time was fantastic. For my money, the best Archaon miniature there has been thus far. It was just Archaon on Dorgar on his horse, but it was so dynamic and so beautifully sculpted. Really, really beautiful miniature. The book is fantastic. It really is, because it's not just a new version of the Chaos Warriors, of the demons, and so on and so forth. It actually provided a new dynamism to the army. You got this sense that they were building, they were massing, the forces of chaos were in the ascendant, and they were about to sweep forth across the lands of man. Great stuff. On the back of that, we also had the Storm of Chaos book itself, which was wonderful. It introduced the campaign, but it also introduced all of these wonderful tertiary army lists. So you could have, for the first time in years, you got a whole demon army list. You could take an army of demons, and instead of them just being like adjuncts to the Chaos Warriors and the Beastmen, you could have an entire Chaos demon army, which was wonderful. A wonderful army that I really got into at the time was the Cult of Slaanesh, which combined Dark Elf and Slaanesh miniatures and spells. Absolutely wonderful. You got Empire forces in the form of Voltan, who was Sigmar reborn. You could actually play as Sigmar back then. It was a really cool time in the Fantasy Battle setting. Unfortunately, switching over to 40k, and there is a span of years here. It was a long time before the 3.5 Codex went the way of the Dodo. But unfortunately, a few years later, Games Workshop went on this, as I mentioned before, this bizarre new dynamic where they were trying to force players to play and collect in particular ways. And unfortunately, there were two codices in 40k released together that emphasized this new dynamic, this new design strategy. And they are the only two codices that conform to it, by the way. They realized very quickly that people hated these codices. They hated this design style. The Chaos Space Marines and the Dark Angels. Chaos Space Marines 4.0 is not only one of the worst codexes ever written, it's one of the worst products Games Workshop have put out for a number of reasons. Now, the 3.5 Codex caused a lot of problems. It caused a lot of problems when it came out because it was so good. It was so brilliant. You could make such amazing, interesting, diverse army lists from it that it put all of the other codices into the shade. It made them all seem inferior, which they were, and as a result, there were lots of chaos armies around at the time, and they were very dominant. In reaction to that, rather than bringing all of the other codices up to standard and making them as good, they decided to gut chaos. And when I say gut, I mean take away everything that lent the army flavour What they could have done to make it work was take the basic format of the 3.5 Codex and just take away some of the complexities, winnow down some of the more abusable elements, like limit the amount of demonic rewards that particular characters could have and that kind of thing. And that would have worked really well. Remove some of the abusable elements like the Iron Warriors army list with their multiple heavy support selections and whatnot, and that would have worked really well. And then work on using that format for all of the other codices. That would have been beautiful. They didn't do that. What they did was the 4.0 Codex, and the 4.0 Codex was the point in which I and many, many, many others jumped ship. We totally jumped ship. Now, just for the purposes of balance, let's look at what is positive in this book first. There are positive elements to this book. Some things people really hated, like, for example, there was an emphasis shift in this book from the legions, the original traitor legions, which basically just became paint schemes in this book, to renegades, to more recent cults and chapters that had turned from the Imperium and to Chaos. And for me, that wasn't a bad thing at all. I actually really like that. I really like that. I like the diversity that comes as a result of that. And the fact that you had the freedom to create whatever kinds of paint scheme or motifs or mutations or histories you liked. Unfortunately, the problem comes when you look at the army list, because the army list is like, it's the most bare bones, pared down thing imaginable. There's no character to it at all. You can't customize anything. Whereas in the 3.5 Codex, each of your miniatures was a character. They had their own backgrounds, they had their own little abilities, they had their own emphases based on what veteran skills they had, what demonic rewards they had, that may not have played a big part in the game itself, but which had enormous flavour and character to them. It lent them emphasis, it gave you a connecting element. Here there's nothing. You have standardised army list entries for everything, and you can't customise them at all. You cannot customise them at all. All of the flavour is ripped out. And as a result of that, the army list is really poorly considered. You have this situation whereby you have artwork next to army list entries that depicts characters that have combinations of war gear that they can't take. They actually can't take in the army list, which is stupid. You have this just anodyne quality where there's no flavour to anything, there's no feeling, there's no narrative emphasis. It's just an army list, and it's more pared down than many of the get you by army lists that you got in the backs of the 40k rulebooks before the codices came out. It's so boring. It's such a boring army list. And not only that, it's not that it's unworkable. It is workable. You can create some killer army lists from it, but they're all the same. They are all exactly the same. There's no character or flavour to anything here, and it's so boring. And when you contrast that to the 3.5 Codex that was just nothing but character, where there are even entries and options that were almost totally redundant in game terms, but which allowed for modelling opportunities, which allowed you to customise the way your army functioned and was cohered on the battlefield. It was a real kick to the teeth. It felt like a real kick to the teeth. And there's a particular reason why they did it. There are a number of reasons why they did it. And one of the big reasons I hate this codex is because demons aren't in it. Or rather, demons are in it, but all you get are these generic entries. Instead of Death Guard Plague Marines being able to fight alongside Plague Bearers and Nerglings and Great Unclean Ones, they can only fight alongside Lesser Demons and Greater Demons. That's it. That's all you can fight with. And the reason they did that is not to benefit the player. It's not because of any background term or anything like that. It's because they were trying to force players into collecting a separate demon list, which is what they did at that point. They actually fractured Chaos. So you had Chaos Space Marines in one codex, you had Chaos Demons in another codex, and you had all of the other entries in another codex, and that was it. That's how it functioned back then. And also back then, no allies system. So you could not say you'd spent a load of time modelling and painstakingly painting and modelling a Great Unclean One for your Death Guard army. It wasn't a Great Unclean One anymore. It was just a generic Greater Demon. It was the same as all the other Greater Demons on the battlefield, and that was it. Unless you went out and then bought an army that you didn't want. You went out and bought the Codex Chaos Demons and a Nergal Demon army, which you maybe didn't want, but what you needed in order to play your Great Unclean One as a Great Unclean One. It was an entirely market-driven decision. There was no heed paid to the way players collect. There was no heed paid to the background, because in the background, Chaos Space Marines fight alongside Chaos Demons, not generic demons, but Bloodletters, Pink Horrors, Demonettes, Plague Bearers, and so on and so forth. It was a scurrilous and really obvious attempt to force Chaos players into collecting two armies, and it failed. I mean, it failed massively. People just stopped collecting. I was one of those people. I didn't come back to the hobby for years. The worst of it is, there are good things in this codex in background terms. For the first time in any of the Chaos Codices, you get this really in-depth look at the psychology of Chaos Space Marines, what it is that they experience when they finally throw off the shackles of the Imperium and their original conditioning. It talks about how they start to remember what it was to be human. They start to realise their old weaknesses, their old emotions, their old desires, and the fact that they can be their own entities now. They have the power and the authority to be their own entities, to realise their own dreams now. That's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. And this was the first codex to do it. It's just such a shame that the rest of the codex is such a hideous, bloody shambles, because that element is wonderful. While we're on the subject of the Codex Chaos Demons, we need to go and look at that, because this was the first time that demons had their own separate codex in 40k. And it's not bad at all. You can actually tell where all of the emphasis was. They were so trying to force Chaos players to play as demons at this point, and not as Chaos Space Marines, because they wanted to sell the new miniatures. They wanted to sell the new Heralds and the new Demonettes and Bloodletters and Plague Bearers and whatnot. That's the reason they did it. That's the reason why they were fractured in this manner. It's not like today, where, yeah, you have separate Demon and Chaos Space Marine codices, but you also have systems whereby they can ally, where they can summon one another, where they can function together, and they have sympathies together. They actually function together, which is wonderful. The army lists function together. It wasn't that way back then. You either collected one or the other. You played with one or the other. You couldn't play with them together. Which, of course, made no sense in background terms. It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And as I say, the Demon Codex, not a bad thing. The Demon Codex is really interesting from this era, because they tried to take Chaos down a different emphasis in terms of its mythology. They turned to classical mythology for the manner in which it was presented. So they looked at ancient Greek mythology, they looked at occultism, they looked at old Celtic mythology and Anglican mythology, and they used that as a framework for how Chaos was presented in background terms, and it really works. It works really, really well. You have an emphasis on the elemental aspects of the Chaos powers, which is wonderful, really, really wonderful. For the first time, you have detailed descriptions of their realms beyond the waking world, of the crystal labyrinth of Zeech, the circles of Slaanesh, the garden of Nergal, and the warlands, the brass citadel of Khorne. You didn't have that before, and that's really wonderful. And the army list isn't bad. It's interesting. It isn't bad, unlike the Chaos Space Marine Codex, and it's full of flavour. You can actually get some really interesting, fun army lists out of this one. But again, they're trying to force you down particular avenues. They did really hate it for some reason. They really hated the idea at the time. Chaos players collecting mono-god armies, so armies dedicated to single Chaos powers. Those armies, back then, certainly for the Chaos Space Marines, but also for Chaos Demons, were crap. They just didn't function very well. In order to function properly, you had to have them all together. You had to have, like, Demonettes of Slaanesh supported by brass cannons of Khorne with Plague Bearers of Nergal and whatnot, and it just... You got this explosion in a paint factory thing where there was no real character to anything. Everything was just sort of all together on the battlefield, and it just felt wrong. These books, for all of their strengths, they really do represent how Games Workshop was kind of treating its fan base at the time, which was fairly shoddily. And unfortunately, it didn't get much better the next time round. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at how that design choice, that emphasis of splitting everything up, seeped its way into fantasy battle. So you started to get Chaos Warrior books, Beastmen army books, and Demon books, which were totally separate from one another. And then we'll also take a look at the 6.0 Chaos Codex, which, to be honest, is a massive slap in the face. it's not much better than the 4.0 Codex. A little better, but not much better. Sad. Yeah, a bit of a negative one this time. Apologies. But after the next video, after we've done 6.0, we're going to be starting to verge on 8th Ed, and that's when it gets really bloody good, I can tell you. That's when it gets really bloody good. So, until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!